From innocent cartoon crushes to complete mental breakdowns, there are lots of animated characters who've accidentally become realistic portrayals of depression. In this video, we're going to be discussing when did Mordecai become depressed. Mordecai's depression journey officially started in Season 3, Episode 25, Yes Dude Yes, and it happened because he completely misread a situation and had a 5-day mental breakdown over absolutely nothing. Before this episode, Mordecai was just your typical awkward guy with a crush on Margaret, the coffee shop girl. Sure, he was nervous around her and struggled to ask her out, but he was still a functioning person. He showed up to work, hung out with Rigby, and generally acted like a normal 20-something. The show had been building up his feelings for Margaret across multiple episodes, with him always finding excuses to visit the coffee shop and getting tongue-tied whenever she was around. Rigby kept pushing him to make a move, and Mordecai kept chickening out, but it was all pretty harmless romantic comedy stuff. Margaret seemed to enjoy their conversations too, always being friendly and asking where he'd been if he didn't show up for a few days. There were definitely some mutual feelings brewing, which made what happened next even more frustrating. The breaking point came when Mordecai finally worked up the courage to ask Margaret to see some cheesy robot movie called Lovebot 2 with him. He got 2 tickets, psyched himself up, and marched into the coffee shop ready to take their relationship to the next level. This was supposed to be his big moment, the day he stopped being just a customer and became something more. He was feeling confident, probably rehearsing his lines, ready to finally shoot his shot. You could see him giving himself a pep talk in the reflection of the coffee shop window, pointing at himself and saying, "You got this." He'd been building up to this moment for months. Then he walked in and saw Margaret hugging some guy who was down on one knee. His brain immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. She was getting engaged. Instead of asking what was happening or even sticking around to find out, Mordecai just froze up, watched her say, "Yes, dude, yes," and walked out in complete shock. Any normal person would have asked questions, but Mordecai's anxiety took over, and he assumed his worst nightmare was coming true. The timing couldn't have been worse. Right when he was finally ready to make his move, it looked like someone else had beaten him to it. What followed was honestly painful to watch. Mordecai didn't just get sad. He had a complete mental breakdown that lasted 5 full days. He locked himself in his room, listening to the same depressing song on repeat, not showering, not going to work, not eating properly. The transcript shows him lying on the floor with his legs on the bed, hair and feathers all disheveled, just groaning in pain whenever Rigby tried to talk to him. Rigby said he smelled like something died, and you could see how gross and pathetic he looked. The guy became a complete zombie because he thought someone he'd never even confessed his feelings to was getting married to someone else. This created a huge problem for everyone around him. Rigby was frustrated watching his best friend fall apart over a girl. Benson was annoyed that Mordecai wasn't doing his job, and the whole park basically had to deal with this depressing music playing constantly. When Rigby tried to get him out of the room, Mordecai would just say dramatic stuff like, "Something died inside of me, my heart." He was being completely ridiculous, but he genuinely couldn't function. Rigby eventually got so fed up that he signed Mordecai up for online dating just to get him out of the house. The dating website was called Couple Corral and had this cowboy theme, which was weird but whatever worked. The dating montage showed Mordecai going through the motions with multiple women, but he was so checked out and depressed that they all just left after one interaction. One girl was trying to talk about fancy restaurants, another about women's representation in media, and Mordecai would just give these dead, uninterested responses. He wasn't even trying to connect with anyone because he was still completely obsessed with Margaret. When he finally met CJ, she actually called him out on his behavior and asked what his deal was. For once, he was honest about being depressed and not wanting to date, and surprisingly, she was cool with just being friends. The real kicker came at the end when Mordecai finally returned to the coffee shop and discovered the truth. The guy Margaret was hugging was her cousin John, who had just gotten a new prosthetic leg. The whole engagement thing was completely in his head. 5 days of depression, missed work, and emotional trauma over a complete misunderstanding that could have been cleared up with one simple question. Margaret even explained that she screamed, "Yes, dude, yes," because she was excited about her cousin's new leg, not because she was getting engaged. This episode established the pattern that would define Mordecai for the rest of the series. Instead of communicating or dealing with his emotions in a healthy way, he would spiral into depression, and make everything worse for everyone around him. It showed that his mental health was really fragile and that he had no idea how to handle romantic stress. This breakdown also introduced him to CJ, who would become his next relationship disaster, proving that his problems with depression and poor decision-making were just getting started. Season 4, Episode 37, Stake Me Amadeus, is where Mordecai's depression story took a devastating turn and showed us exactly what happens when all your romantic hopes get crushed in one brutal moment. By this point in the series, Mordecai and Margaret had been building their relationship for over a year. After the whole CJ misunderstanding from yes dude yes, Mordecai had gotten back on track with Margaret and things were actually going really well. The episode opens with this beautiful montage of them doing couple stuff, looking at clouds, going to the aquarium, riding bikes, taking cute photos together, and even kissing on a Ferris wheel. They were acting like a real couple in everything but name, and Mordecai was finally ready to make it official. He'd been practicing in the mirror, trying to figure out the perfect way to ask her to be his girlfriend. This felt like his moment. Everything was lining up perfectly. Mordecai had been planning this dinner for weeks, collecting these special Amadeus dollars by doing favors for everyone at the park. He traded with Pops, Benson, Skips, everyone, just to get enough fake money to afford this fancy restaurant called Stake Me Amadeus. Rigby was impressed enough to give him brospect and hand over his own Amadeus dollars. This dinner meant everything to Mordecai. He was going to ask Margaret to officially be his girlfriend at the fanciest place in town. He had his suit on. He was nervous but excited, and he genuinely believed this was going to be the night that changed everything for the better. The whole thing started falling apart before they even sat down. First, Margaret called and said she'd be late, which threw off his timing. Then, when he got to the restaurant and tried to pay with the Amadeus dollars, it turned out they were counterfeit, and the FBI showed up to arrest him. Suddenly, Mordecai was in handcuffs, being interrogated by federal agents, with his entire plan falling apart. The agents gave him one chance to prove his innocence. He had to help them catch the counterfeiter during his date with Margaret. So now, instead of a romantic evening, he was wearing a wire and trying to solve a crime, while also attempting to ask the most important question of his life. The dinner itself was a disaster from start to finish. Mordecai was trying to balance his FBI mission with having a romantic conversation, getting interrupted by agents in his earpiece, while Margaret was sitting right there. When the counterfeiter showed up, who turned out to be that crazy robot bear from an earlier episode, everything exploded into this massive shootout in the restaurant. But here's the thing that really gets me. Even with bullets flying everywhere and tables flipping and people screaming, Mordecai still tried to have his moment. He grabbed Margaret's hands behind an overturned table and poured his heart out, telling her how the last few weeks with her had been the best of his life and asking her to be his girlfriend. And that's when Margaret completely destroyed him. She started crying and pulled out this letter from Milton University, her dream school. She told him that for the first time in her life, she felt like she could be in a real relationship that could go somewhere, but she'd gotten accepted to college and might never get this opportunity again. She said she was sorry, but she couldn't be his girlfriend, and then she ran out of the restaurant crying while Mordecai just knelt there, completely broken. The immediate aftermath was brutal to watch. Everyone in the restaurant, his friends, the FBI agents, even the criminals, just stared at Mordecai in shock and sympathy. This guy had just been rejected in the most devastating way possible, during a literal gunfight after months of building up to this moment. The transcript shows him dropping to his knees, heartbroken and devastated by losing what he thought was the love of his life. Even the robot bear tried to make a joke about college being overrated before getting blown up by a rocket launcher, which just added insult to injury. The episode ended with Mordecai taking Margaret to the airport and then sitting on the roof, staring at the sunset in complete silence. When Rigby asked if he wanted to talk about it, he just said no. You could see that something fundamental had broken inside him. This wasn't like the 5-day depression from Yes Dude Yes, where he was being dramatic about a misunderstanding. Margaret had genuinely chosen her future over their relationship, and there was nothing he could do about it. This rejection set up everything that came after in Mordecai's story. It showed him that even when you do everything right, even when the other person has feelings for you too, sometimes it just doesn't work out. Margaret's decision was completely reasonable. College is important, and she shouldn't have to give up her dreams for a relationship. But for Mordecai, this became proof that he was destined to lose everyone he cared about. It planted the seeds of insecurity and fear that would ruin every relationship he had going forward, because now he knew that even mutual love wasn't enough to guarantee a happy ending. Season 6, Episode 12, Merry Christmas Mordecai, is where Mordecai's depression story took its most destructive turn, when one accidental kiss destroyed his relationship with CJ and created the love triangle nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of the series.
No, it's not.
CJ, wait! Awkward.
By this point, Mordecai had actually been doing pretty well. He'd been dating CJ for a while, they seemed happy together, and he was excited about spending their first Christmas as a couple. Margaret had been away at college, so there wasn't any drama between them. CJ was this cool, laid-back girlfriend who shared his interests and genuinely made him happy. For once in his life, Mordecai seemed to have figured out the whole relationship thing. He was in a stable, healthy relationship with someone who actually liked him back, and everything was going smoothly. The trouble started when Eileen invited everyone to her Christmas sweater party and casually mentioned that Margaret would be there. Mordecai immediately panicked because he knew this was a disaster waiting to happen. He spent the whole day freaking out about what would happen if Margaret and CJ were in the same room together. He even had this nightmare scenario where he imagined himself accidentally calling Margaret his girlfriend in front of CJ and then literally sinking into the ground while making it worse with every word. When Benson sent him to the post office and he actually ran into Margaret, he completely lost it and made up some ridiculous story about getting a phone call from Benson so he could run away from her. The party itself started out okay. Mordecai was nervous and sweaty, but he managed to introduce Margaret and CJ to each other without completely embarrassing himself. When CJ asked if he still had feelings for Margaret, he told her no, and that he was happy with her, which seemed to satisfy CJ. They shared a kiss. She said, "That's all I needed to know," and for a moment it looked like everything was going to be fine. Mordecai actually relaxed and started enjoying the party, dancing with CJ and hanging out with his friends like a normal person. But then, CJ went to use the bathroom.
Actually, I gotta use the restroom.
Better take a number, that's a long line.
I'll take my chances. Be back soon.
And that's when everything fell apart. Mordecai was looking around for her when he accidentally ran into Margaret in the hallway. Margaret tried to talk to him, but Mordecai panicked and caused this chain reaction that sent Rigby's mistletoe disco ball flying into a bowl of eggnog. The disco ball started glowing red and projecting these weird reflections of Margaret all around Mordecai. In this trippy sequence, all the Margaret reflections were talking to him, asking him not to shut her out, and reminding him of the good times they had together. Mordecai finally opened up and told her that things were different now, that he was happy with CJ, and that she was good for him. Here's where it gets really messed up. Margaret said she understood and that she was glad he was happy, and they shared this friendly hug while saying Merry Christmas to each other. But then Mordecai started having flashbacks to all their best moments together, riding bikes, eating pizza, going to the aquarium, taking photos, and especially their kiss from Meteor Moves. When the flashback ended, he was so caught up in the memory that he was actually kissing Margaret in real life. They both immediately realized what happened and started apologizing to each other, but it was too late. CJ had come back from the bathroom and saw the whole thing. The transcript shows her just standing there saying, "Mordecai?" in this heartbroken voice. She turned gray and stormed out of the house while Mordecai desperately tried to chase after her. By the time he got outside, she was already driving away, leaving him standing there knowing he'd just destroyed the best relationship he'd ever had. When he went back inside to find his phone so he could call her, he discovered that Margaret's stuff was all over Eileen's spare room because she was moving in as Eileen's new roommate. In the aftermath, CJ was completely heartbroken and felt betrayed by the one person she trusted. Margaret was horrified that she'd accidentally ruined Mordecai's relationship. Mordecai was left standing in that room, surrounded by Margaret's boxes, realizing that his ex-girlfriend was about to become a permanent part of his life again, just as he'd destroyed his current relationship. The episode ended on this cliffhanger with Margaret staring at him from the hallway, both of them knowing that everything had just gotten incredibly complicated. This kiss created the toxic love triangle that would define the rest of Mordecai's story. It proved to CJ that he wasn't over Margaret, which made her constantly suspicious and insecure going forward. It showed Margaret that there were still feelings between them, which gave her hope that maybe they could work things out. And it confirmed Mordecai's worst fears about himself, that he was destined to ruin every good thing in his life. From this point on, every interaction between the three of them was poisoned by the memory of this moment, and Mordecai's depression would only get worse as he tried and failed to fix the mess he'd created. Before we get into the helicopter disaster, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. And now let's get back to where we left off. Season 6, Episode 20, 1000th Chopper Flight Party, is where Mordecai's relationship anxiety reached a breaking point when his attempts to avoid drama with Margaret backfired spectacularly and almost got people killed. After the Christmas kiss incident, Mordecai and CJ had managed to patch things up, but their relationship was walking on thin ice. When they got invited to Margaret's dad's 1000th helicopter flight party, CJ couldn't go because she was volunteering at a river cleanup. Mordecai was actually relieved about this because he knew having Margaret and CJ in the same place would be a disaster waiting to happen. CJ trusted him to go alone and even asked him to bring back some cake, which showed she was trying to move past their issues. Mordecai promised to bring her cake and called her the coolest girlfriend ever, and for a moment it seemed like they might actually be okay. The party was at Margaret's parents' house, and Mordecai was determined not to mess things up this time. He brought Rigby and Eileen for backup, hoping that having friends around would keep him from doing anything stupid. Margaret's dad, Frank, was being really nice to Mordecai, Mordecai, treating him like family and even picking him for the special guest seat on the helicopter's 1000th flight. But when Frank found out Mordecai had a new girlfriend, you could see he was disappointed. He clearly still hoped Mordecai and Margaret would get back together. Margaret showed up with her news crew to report on the party, and Mordecai immediately started panicking and ran to hide in the bathroom. Rigby had to drag Mordecai out of the bathroom and promised to protect him from any awkward interactions with Margaret. What followed was this ridiculous montage of Rigby trying to sabotage every potential conversation between Mordecai and Margaret. When Margaret tried to approach them, Rigby would do something gross or distracting to make her go away, like eating a whole plate of deviled eggs and shoving it at her, or drawing a line across a banner and sticking his butt in her face. Mordecai was so paranoid about screwing up that he let Rigby turn the whole party into this awkward mess instead of just acting like a normal person. When it came time for the helicopter ride, Mordecai got picked as the special guest and had to get on the chopper with Margaret and her parents. At first, he was being super weird and awkward, giving gibberish answers to Margaret's questions and looking like he wanted to jump out of the helicopter. Margaret finally called him out on it, asking why he was being so strange and pointing out that this was supposed to be fun. Mordecai relaxed and started doing a fake traffic report as a joke, which made them both laugh and reminded them of the good times they used to have together. For a few minutes, it actually seemed like they could be normal friends again. But then CJ showed up. The river cleanup had been canceled because someone got chemical burns from the polluted water, so she decided to come to the party after all. When she looked up and saw Mordecai and Margaret in the helicopter together, laughing and having a great time, she immediately assumed the worst. Mordecai spotted her on the ground and panicked, trying to get her attention to explain the situation. But when he stood up and started waving, the helicopter jerked and he fell right onto Margaret's lap. From CJ's perspective on the ground, it looked like Mordecai was getting cozy with his ex-girlfriend while she was stuck cleaning up toxic waste. CJ completely lost it and turned into a massive storm cloud, creating winds so strong that she nearly brought down the helicopter. Margaret's parents got blown out of the chopper and had to cannonball into the pool to save themselves. Mordecai accidentally shoved the cake he'd been saving for CJ into Margaret's mouth, which made CJ even angrier. Margaret was hanging off the helicopter by one wing, while Mordecai desperately tried to explain that nothing was happening between them. In the chaos, Mordecai threw the cake plate out of the helicopter, which was basically the last straw for CJ, since that cake was supposed to be for her. The disaster only ended when Margaret grabbed a megaphone and shouted that she had a boyfriend, revealing that weekend sports anchor Del Hanlon had just shown up to the party. CJ immediately calmed down and realized she'd almost killed people over a misunderstanding. Season 6, episode 28, Dumped at the Altar, is where Mordecai hit rock bottom by hijacking his best friend's wedding to have a public breakdown about his love life, creating one of the most cringe-worthy moments in cartoon history. By this point, Mordecai's relationship with CJ was hanging by a thread after all the Margaret drama from the previous episodes. They were both trying to pretend everything was fine, but you could tell from their awkward phone conversations that they were just going through the motions. CJ had been thinking about their relationship and clearly wanted to have a serious talk, but Mordecai kept brushing it off and saying everything was fine when it obviously wasn't. Meanwhile, Muscle Man was getting married to Starla, and this was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. All the park workers were helping with the wedding preparations, and Mordecai was trying to focus on being a good friend instead of dealing with his relationship problems. The tension started building from the moment Margaret and CJ both showed up to the wedding. Mordecai completely fumbled his interaction with Margaret, awkwardly complimenting her shoes instead of her dress, while Rigby watched in embarrassment. Then when CJ arrived, he was suddenly smooth and confident, which just highlighted how weird he was being around Margaret. CJ tried to tell him she'd been thinking about things, but before she could finish, Muscle Man had a complete meltdown about not having a letter from his deceased father. This gave Mordecai the perfect excuse to avoid the conversation he needed to have with CJ by running off to help Muscle Man find the letter in his messy trailer. While searching through Muscle Man's disgusting trailer, Rigby dropped a bombshell. He'd been secretly dating Eileen for months and was actually happy in his relationship. This was a huge wake-up call for Mordecai because his best friend had been in a healthy, drama-free relationship this whole time, while Mordecai was drowning in his own romantic disasters. Rigby gave him some simple advice. Just follow your gut for once instead of overthinking everything. Rigby's relationship with Eileen was proof that romance didn't have to be complicated, but Mordecai was making everything 10 times harder than it needed to be. When they found Muscle Dad's letter and rushed back to the wedding, Muscle Man was too emotional to read it himself and begged Mordecai to read it for for him. The letter was this beautiful message about finding your soulmate and trusting your gut when you know you found the right person. As Mordecai read it out loud, you could see something clicking in his brain. Muscle Dad's advice about trusting your gut, combined with Rigby's words, finally pushed Mordecai over the edge. Instead of just finishing the letter and letting Muscle Man get married, Mordecai completely lost it and started giving his own speech about soulmates and relationships. What happened next was absolutely painful to watch. Mordecai grabbed the microphone and started rambling about how he used to think soulmates didn't exist, but now he wasn't sure. He looked around the wedding crowd and started pointing at random people, saying maybe they were his soulmate, including some old lady in the audience. Benson was whispering angrily, asking why he was talking, and Rigby was making frantic gestures for him to shut up and get off the stage. But Mordecai kept going, saying he didn't know if there was one perfect person for him and that he'd been ignoring his gut because he didn't want to hurt anyone. Then he walked straight up to CJ and started to tell her something, clearly planning to break up with her right there in front of everyone. CJ cut him off before he could finish, telling him to save it because she already knew what he was going to say. She was heartbroken and angry, pointing out that he'd just given this whole speech about not knowing who his soulmate was and hadn't even pointed in her direction when he was looking around the room. She handed him back the charm bracelet he'd given her and ran out crying while Mordecai just stood there. Muscle Man was furious that Mordecai had hijacked his wedding and sarcastically asked if it was okay to get married now. The whole crowd was staring at Mordecai in shock and disgust as he realized what he'd just done. The immediate aftermath was devastating for everyone involved. CJ left the wedding heartbroken, Muscle Man's special moment was ruined, and all the wedding guests had just witnessed Mordecai have a public meltdown. Later, when Mordecai finally caught up with CJ outside, they had a brief conversation where she officially dumped him. The transcript shows them hugging goodbye before she rode away on her bike, leaving Mordecai standing there knowing he'd destroyed everything. When Rigby asked him how it went, Mordecai said they were taking a break, but everyone knew it was really over. This episode marked the end of Mordecai's relationship with CJ and showed just how selfish and self-absorbed he'd become. He literally used his friend's wedding as therapy, making Muscle Man's most important day all about his own romantic confusion. It proved that Mordecai had learned nothing from all his previous mistakes and was still the same emotionally immature person who couldn't handle his feelings without dragging everyone else down with him. This moment would haunt him for the rest of the series and set up his complete mental breakdown in the next episode. Season 7, Episode 1, Dumptown USA is where Mordecai hit absolute rock bottom by disappearing to a literal island of broken men and living like a complete slob for 2 weeks while everyone thought he'd vanished off the face of the earth. After the wedding disaster where he'd publicly humiliated himself and lost CJ, Mordecai just completely gave up on life. He didn't show up to work for 2 weeks, didn't answer his phone, and basically disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. Benson had been calling him 347 times trying to reach him, but Mordecai had left his phone behind in the couch cushions. His parents didn't know where he was, Margaret hadn't heard from him, and obviously CJ wasn't going to be checking on him anytime soon. Rigby was so busy being happy with Eileen that he didn't even notice his best friend had vanished until Benson threatened to fire Mordecai if he didn't come back to work. The mystery got solved when Rigby found a postcard from Dumptown USA hidden under Mordecai's mattress. The postcard was from Sad Sax Guy, basically advertising this place as a paradise for recently dumped men where they could forget their problems and jam with other single bros. Turns out Benson knew all about Dumptown because he'd been there 5 times himself after various breakups throughout his life, with Ashley, Monica, Patricia, Lisa, and most recently, Audrey. The catch was that you could only get there by actually being dumped, so Rigby had to convince Eileen to fake break up with him just so Sad Sax Guy would transport him there. When Rigby finally made it to Dumptown, what he found was absolutely disgusting. The whole place was filled with depressed men in bathrobes who had completely given up on basic hygiene and self-care. Everyone looked like slobs and lived in filthy conditions, spending their days doing meaningless activities like playing terrible volleyball, floating around a lazy river, and eating junk food alone at table-for-one buffets. The worst part was that Rigby couldn't even recognize Mordecai at first.
You've changed, man. I don't even know who I'm talking to anymore.
Because he'd transformed into this gross version of himself with long brown hair, a scraggly beard, sunglasses, and a dirty bathrobe. Mordecai had been living in this beach house with 5 other losers.
Yeah, man, you just got in late September.
And because he was the newest guy, he was responsible for getting food for everyone. He was eating cereal straight out of the box with milk poured into it, living in a house full of trash and flies, and genuinely believing this was paradise. The transcript shows him offering Rigby the soggy cereal box and acting like this lifestyle was amazing. He'd completely lost track of time and thought he'd only been there for a couple of days when it had actually been 2 full weeks. The place had this weird effect where guys would lose all sense of reality and just exist in this depressing bubble. The breaking point came when Rigby tried to snap Mordecai Mordecai out of it during a terrible saxophone practice session. All the residents were playing their instruments horribly off-key, and when Rigby finally exploded and told Mordecai he'd been there for 2 weeks, Mordecai was genuinely shocked. The other residents were so far gone they were talking about 1994 and couldn't remember basic details about their lives. When Rigby held up a saxophone so Mordecai could see his reflection, he finally realized what a mess he'd become. The image of himself, this bearded, dirty, broken man, combined with looking around at his sick housemates and the disgusting living conditions, finally woke him up. Getting out of Dumptown turned into this crazy chase scene because the other residents didn't want to lose their food guy. Mordecai and Rigby had to steal a motor scooter and jump a rising drawbridge to escape while being chased by angry men in bathrobes. Sad Sax Guy flew them back to the park, where Benson immediately yelled at Mordecai to shower, burn his bathrobe, and get back to work or be fired. The whole experience was like waking up from a 2-week nightmare where Mordecai had completely lost himself. This episode was significant because it showed how Mordecai's depression had progressed from specific relationship problems to a complete abandonment of responsibility and self-care. He'd gone from being the sensible one who tried to do the right thing to literally running away from his life and living in denial on an island of broken men. The fact that he lost track of time and genuinely thought 2 weeks was just a couple of days showed how disconnected from reality he'd become. When they got back to the park, Rigby gave him some simple but important advice. Take a break from dating and focus on what's best for himself. This marked a turning point where Mordecai finally accepted that he needed to step away from romantic relationships entirely and work on his own mental health. The episode ended with the promise that maybe, just maybe, he could start putting his life back together, but only after hitting the absolute lowest point possible and having his best friend literally rescue him from his own self-destruction. So when did Mordecai become depressed? It started in season 3 with Yes Dude Yes and got worse over 4 seasons. That 5-day breakdown over thinking Margaret was engaged set the pattern for everything after. Before that, Mordecai was just awkward with crushes. After that, romance became his weakness. You can track his decline episode by episode. Stake Me Amadeus broke his heart. Merry Christmas Mordecai showed he couldn't handle emotions. The helicopter episode proved his anxiety created his worst fears. The wedding speech was pure cringe that fans still hate. By Dumptown USA, he'd completely lost it. 2 weeks missing, living like a slob, losing track of time. That's not cartoon comedy, that's real depression wrapped in regular show's weird humor. The pattern is clear. Each romantic failure made the next one worse. He'd get rejected, spiral into depression, make terrible decisions, get rejected again. Classic downward spiral that destroyed 2 relationships and almost cost him his job. What's crazy is how realistic it feels. Mordecai's depression journey is more believable than most live-action shows. Even though regular show was just a surreal comedy, fans had mixed reactions. Some hated watching him become this anxious mess. The wedding speech especially divided people. Character assassination or realistic breakdown. Early Mordecai tried to do right. Later Mordecai couldn't handle normal situations. He went from keeping Rigby grounded to needing constant support himself. The depression never got resolved. Mordecai just avoided dating completely until randomly marrying someone we barely knew in the finale. Those 6 episodes accidentally created one of animation's best depression storylines. Pretty impressive for a show about slackers having weird adventures. What do you think? Do you agree with me? Or do you think there was another moment when Mordecai became depressed? Let me know in the comments. That's it for now. Be sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.